Hi, this is Suzanne Etkin with the Watershed Stewards Academy bringing you grant writing. It's easy as pie. I wrote my first grant, my first real grant, around 2007 when we were trying to fund this little idea about training community leaders to coordinate environmental restoration. You know it now as the Watershed Stewards Academy, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I wrote some grants. We got some funding, and here we are over a decade later with an organization that has grown, and it's grown through grant writing and fundraising and a variety of other funding. And I've written, many grants. I've gotten many grants. I've also not gotten some grants, and I've learned a lot along the way. And what I'd like to share with you today is some tips and tricks for writing grants. And I think you'll find that if you follow these tips and tricks, you'll find that grant writing is really just as easy as baking a pie. So the first step is to find the right idea. You want to find an idea that's appetizing, that sounds really delicious to your stakeholders. And your stakeholders might be people in your community, could be some funders, but it's really got to be delicious to you also. You should not ever write a grant for an idea that you don't want to implement, because you're going to be the one doing the majority of the work on this project. So it's really important to tailor your idea to your community. It's good to find an idea that addresses a problem or offers an exciting solution that really meets your community where they are. One time I had a grant written for my community to do a wind turbine, and we could have paid for all of our electricity in our community. We live in a really windy part of the Eastern Shore, and we could have paid for all of our electricity in our community within 3 years and just had free electric. For the life of the wind turbine. But what I didn't understand is that that was not something that my community was interested in. And so I did all this work to write this proposal, but really when it came down to it, there were some key people in my community that just really did not like that idea. So it was not successful. It's really important to fit your idea with your community. It's also a good idea to take a look at the cost and the timeline and the scale of your idea and make sure you can do it within the time that you have and within the funding that you might expect to get. So developing the right idea is the first step. And within Watershed Stewards Academy, your assessment process and your conversations and site visits with your mentor will help you really to hone that idea before you even start writing a grant. The next thing you want to do is build your team. Just like the ingredients of a pie or a cake, you want to choose only the best ingredients because your outcome is only going to taste as good as what goes in. Although this will be your project, you will need other people's help. So you want to think about who else in your community might work with you on this project. Who do you want to work with and who wants to work with you? And I always like to select people that are enjoyable, that I don't mind spending some time with, that bring a unique skill set to the project. You might be a person that's really comfortable with plants and trees and digging in the dirt, but you might be less comfortable with talking to people or getting people interested or the whole community outreach. So you want to get some people on your team that can complement your skills. We've also had people that are not all that confident in choosing plants or in the technical aspects of projects, but they're really good at engaging people. So it's a good idea to bring people on your team that have skill sets that you need. You want people, of course, that can be relied on to fulfill their obligations. So enthusiasm alone doesn't make a good team member. And then also people that are not overcommitted. So sometimes we have the best intentions of wanting to help, but if we don't have time, that's a real thing. So build your team. That's the next. The third step is to choose the right funder. We've given you some resources about some of the area's funders. You've met some funders, but when you pick a funder that you think might fund your type of project, you want to go ahead and read very carefully the funder's website and the thing called the request for proposals. You'll hear that um, quite a few times, request for proposal or RFP. That's essentially this big long document where the grantor outlines what it is that they want to fund and how you apply for those funds. So read that really carefully. Pay careful attention to what the grant deadline is and then when are decisions made. If you want to put a project in May, you can't apply for funding in March and expect maybe necessarily to have that funding in hand by the time you need to put your project in the ground. So often there's a grant deadline, then there's a time when you might hear back about the grant, and then there's another lag time for when you might receive the funds. So you want to just pay careful attention to that. Does the funder fund the type of project that you intend to lead? What budget items does the funder fund? Sometimes funders will only fund native plants or they won't fund refreshments or t-shirts. And a lot of times you can take a look at what the funder's goals and priorities are, what projects they've funded in the past. And what I really like to do is to get as much information as I can from the funder's website and the request for proposal. And then if it's allowed, don't hesitate to talk to your funder before you start your grant application. In fact, there are some funding programs that require a site visit before you even start an application. So funders are real people. I think you'll find many of the funders that fund environmental work are incredibly friendly and easy to work with, but making contact before you finalize your idea is a good idea to do. The next step is to make a good plan. So, when you're cooking or baking, you want to set all your ingredients out. You want to make sure you've got everything. You want to know that you have enough time to let your pie dough rest or to let the bread dough rise or whatever it is. So you want to start early and make a list of what your deadlines are. You'll need to have a tax ID, which I'm going to actually talk about in the next slide. The next thing is communication. So your project is likely to change significantly from when you have your first idea to when you submit your grant application. And it's really, really important to keep that communication with your team and your community. And if the funder, if it's appropriate, throughout the process of things changing. Because if you've met with your team or your community at the beginning and they're not part of some of the changes that inevitably happen on your way to writing your grant application, they may not be on board with it at the end. So communication throughout the process is really important. You want to make sure all components are accounted for. You've got your budget, you've got your site assessment, maybe you've called Miss Utility and you know if there's any utility conflicts. And we'll be learning a lot more about all of those things in upcoming sessions. And then you can strengthen your proposal by uniqueness. Why should they fund your project with many others that they might be looking at, and then to align your project with the funder's expectation. And again, you can find all of that information on the funder's website most of the time. Okay, so wait, what is a fiscal agent? I said I was going to come back to the tax ID situation. So funders don't usually give funds to individuals. It's not like I'm Mary Stewart and I'm going to go out and ask Chesapeake Bay Trust to pay me to plant trees. Usually they will want to give funds to an organization like a community association. Some funders will require a nonprofit to be the fiscal agent, and some will give to community associations. So a fiscal agent is simply an organization with a tax ID number, and a lot of times it's a tax exempt organization, 501c3, that agrees to accept donations on behalf of a group that does not have the IRS tax exemption. So if you're a steward, you might ask your congregation to be the fiscal agent. That means they're applying for the grant. You may be writing it, but it's their tax ID number, and they're going to receive the money and process the money. Could be the homeowners association or a community club, could be a local watershed group or another nonprofit. And if you need some help finding a fiscal agent, or if you don't know what's involved in being a fiscal agent, your capstone mentor can talk to you a little bit more about that. But you can't just as an individual steward apply for money and get money most of the time. Okay, this is my favorite step of the grant writing process. So if you've ever baked, you know that a simple error in reading the directions can cause big problems. So, what have you ever added a tablespoon of baking soda instead of a teaspoon? Or have you ever added the flour, before the eggs, and then you end up beating the flour too much? So really following the directions is important. And if you just follow directions, you'll end up with a good cake or pie or bread. It's pretty foolproof if you just follow the directions. And it's the same thing with grants. It's really no more than reading and following the directions. So read the request for proposals, or RFP. You'll hear that a lot. Read them completely before beginning, and then simply answer the questions. So you want to summarize the main points. You want to write short sentences and short paragraphs. I find it really useful to use headings and lists and tables. I also find it helpful to actually copy the question right in your narrative. So if the question is, describe the project and its impact on your community, I would copy, describe the project and its impact in your community, and then I would answer the question so that the reviewer can clearly see what question you're trying to answer. And if you're unclear about what the funder means by their question or their directions, there's often text to explain it or examples, and you can also try to find an example grant. And if all else fails, you can also ask the funder, what do they mean by this? The most important thing is to use everyday language and phrases and words. No flowery language. This is not creative writing. Do not try to use complicated analogies. Just say what it is that you're going to do. Be very, very clear. Avoid jargon or uncommon terms, and if you need to use an uncommon term, define it. You want to write as if the funder has absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I've written some grants, and I've explained things in a way that I think is really clear, and the funder has come back with lots of questions, and I had no idea how they could possibly have those questions because I wrote it very clearly. What helps, what would have helped if I had asked someone who had no familiarity with my project to read my application, and then they would have had, of course, those questions. So sometimes we can think we're explaining things clearly because we're so involved in the project, but it's helpful to have someone else read your application. And then the last thing is proofread, proofread, proofread. And again, someone else can help you with this if you've read it too many times. So the next thing is to break it into parts. And this is, as you're following the directions, break down each question. And again, copy the question and then write the answer to the question. It's pretty simple. It's difficult to write an entire grant start to finish, but if you break it down question by question, it becomes pretty manageable. Here are a couple of specific tips as you're breaking things down. Often the grant will ask you to describe the problem. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And what you want to do is to describe a problem that's about the same size as your solution. So if you're doing, a community tree planting, don't describe the problem, which is, global warming or, tree loss throughout the world. Your problem and your solution should be similar sized, so that your project seems like it's a project that will have impact. You also don't want to describe the problem as the absence of your project. So if there's flooding and you might say, we don't have enough trees to stop flooding, that's probably not the case and the funder will know that. The problem is that there's increased impervious surface causing lots of flooding, and one way to solve that is with trees. Um, so you want to just sort of pay attention to how you're presenting your problem. The details, all of these details can be broken down, and the RFP will probably spell out all of these questions. How many people will your project benefit? What's already taken place? Has there been outreach? You can definitely talk about things that have happened already to pave the way for your project. And then just be really clear on the who, what, when, where, how, and why of the budget is the other part, one of the most important parts. You want your budget to be realistic. Um, Sometimes it's hard to put numbers in a budget, and we can help you with some estimating, but you want to consider everything that will be required. So if you're planting trees, who's going to water the trees? Do you need to have tree gators? And those are just bags that go around the trees that you can fill up with water that allow you to water. Um, One thing that people forget about when they're doing projects is when you're building a garden, often there's excess soil or grass that needs to be taken away. Well, who's going to do that and where's it going to go? That can sometimes be an added expense. Um, what's allowed? You want to really read carefully about what the funder will fund. Um, and sometimes funders don't pay for t-shirts or food. Sometimes funders only fund projects on public property. So really check out the funding criteria carefully and provide detailed explanations as they're needed. Okay. The almost last step is review and submit. So have an outside person look at your grant with a fresh pair of eyes, and then use their feedback. Submit the proposal on time, or better yet, ahead of time. A lot of these proposals are submitted through an online portal, and they're famous for going out at the last minute when everybody's trying to access them. So do that ahead of time. Plan for the unexpected, internet outage, or your kid needs something and you can't pay attention to the grant that you need to submit, or whatever else unforeseen circumstance. And then also keep your team informed. It's really fun when you hit submit on that grant to send an email to your team saying, hey, it's submitted, let's cross our fingers. So that's an exciting. Successful grant writing. So we're almost to the end here. I hope you have gotten a lot of great tips and tricks. But just to remind you of a couple, start early, contact the funding sponsor or your fiscal agent, align with the priorities of your funder. Write your proposal with a review process in mind. So, when you submit a grant, there's going to be real people that are going to review it. They're going to determine whether your project gets funding or doesn't get funding. And remember that these people are probably reading a whole ton of grants. So make it as easy as possible for them to understand what you're doing and why you should get the grant. So really be very well organized, write clearly, follow the instructions. Again, that tip of copying the question and then answering the question is a really good one. Have someone other than yourself review it. Don't be too ambitious or unrealistic. Grantors know, projects that are sort of outside of scope. Have a reasonable and accurate budget. And finally, submit it on time. So if you do all of these things, find that grant writing really is easy as pie.